everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief. Before we get started on today's interview, just a quick reminder that you can make sure you don't miss a single episode of Trendlines by subscribing to it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcast app of your choice. The U.S. military has played a prominent role in Donald Trump's presidency, at times a political prop to flatter his ego, at others a tool to be instrumentalized, but also often a punching bag used to deflect blame. In the early days of his administration, he filled his cabinet and White House staff with retired generals, only to successively fire them or watch them resign over policy differences. Later, his repeated pardons of U.S. soldiers convicted by military courts of war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan drove a wedge between himself and a military leadership committed to upholding discipline and the international laws of war. Most recently, his attempt to deploy the military to quell protests against racism and police brutality in cities across the U.S. ultimately led to the firing of his third defense secretary, Mark Esper. It's perhaps no surprise that Trump's disregard for norms and the rule of law would extend to his approach to the military, with serious implications for the relationship between the military and the civilian leadership at the top of the chain of command. In today's Trendlines interview, I'm joined by Risa Brooks. Dr. Brooks is the Alice Chalmers Associate Professor of Political Science at Marquette University, a non-resident senior associate in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and an adjunct scholar at West Point's Modern War Institute. Risa, thanks so much for joining us on Trendlines.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, before we get to a look at civil-military relations during the Trump presidency, why don't you walk all our listeners through what we mean when we talk about civil-military relations and what normal looks like in terms of U.S. civil-military relations?
Sure. So when folks are talking about civil-military relations, they can mean a variety of different relationships. They can talk about the military's relationship to civilian society. They sometimes are referring to intra-military relationships with different layers and levels of the military institution. But I think most commonly people are thinking about the relationship between the civilian political leadership, the president, Congress, political appointees in the Department of Defense, and the uniformed military, and the sort of interactions and relationships there. When we think about what's normal in the US, we usually focus on this idea of civilian control of the military. And that idea is ultimately that civilian elected political leadership has the final say, final authority over what the military does. And that the way that the military interacts with the civilian leadership should support the accomplishment of civilian political goals and preferences. So the system should be set up to allow those elected leaders to achieve what they want. And these principles are embodied in the Constitution. They're reflected in the designation of the president as commander-in-chief and Congress's prerogatives to fund the military, to regulate it. It's intersected by a variety of laws and regulations in the Department of Defense and in the military. And then you have something called norms, which are sort of informal proscriptions on behavior. And I think those are the things that civil military relations scholars talk about a lot as being really central to filling out and providing the substance to civil military relations. And it's actually these norms that have been somewhat troubled in the last 4 years and have taken a bit of a beating in terms of their robustness that a lot of people have been concerned about during the Trump administration.
So we have a certain amount of codification, I imagine, in the military code of conduct, and you mentioned legislation, a certain amount of norms and traditions. But in practice, for instance, what kinds of orders can the civilian leadership of the military expect absolute obedience from the military chain of command?
Pretty much everything. I mean, in our system of government, in a democratic system of government, the civilians really, you know, give the orders and sort of provide the leadership and guidance. And there's really not an outside constraint on what the president can do. To the extent there is, it comes from Congress or from the courts, not from the military, sort of constraining the prerogatives of what the president can do. Now, there are some cases in which an order might be illegal, and it is incumbent upon military personnel to disobey an illegal order. But in practice, there's a lot that can be done within legal authority and within the sort of rules set, the orders given by the president or secretary of defense, the National Command Authority, and then be sort of guidance or sort of rules set by also by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in a lot of settings, and by other military commanders, depending on what the issue is and what's going on in that particular scenario. So there really isn't this idea that somebody else is constraining the civilians. The American people, via their elected officials and via their institutions, constrain what the president does, not the military.
At the same time, there's a back and forth when it comes to trying to find the best, most effective, and most advisable path forward. So what kinds of options do military commanders have for these orders that are perfectly legal and that under the norms of civil military relations they have to follow, but they disagree with?
Sure. Let me just speak to your first point because it's really important. There's a lot more to civil military relations than just this authority dimension, meaning following orders. To really function properly, there needs to be a lot of healthy interaction, consultation, good faith efforts by the civilian leadership to listen to the military's advice and for the military to understand and conform that advice to what civilians need. So we often focus on this, giving orders authority aspect of civilian control, but there's so much more to it that actually makes it functional. In terms of sort of what options a military commander or enlisted personnel have in a situation, officer and enlisted personnel, they don't have a lot of options. I mean, they have to disobey an overtly illegal order, but even there, determining what is an illegal order might not be so easy. Say, let's give an example. Say the military is sent to assist law enforcement in some capacity. Suppose, like, we go back to June when Donald Trump was talking about invoking something called the Insurrection Act, which would have allowed him to deploy active duty forces to the streets, whether or not governors, states wanted them. That would have enabled the military to do a lot of things that we might find worrisome, including, providing logistical support, even getting out and, backing up law enforcement on the streets. And none of that would have been illegal. If there is something really overt that violates domestic law or international law, military personnel can go talk to the judge advocate that's assigned. There are different levels. They're assigned at different levels of the chain of command and sort of consult. But in the moment, that might be difficult to do that. And I guess I should add one other thing. The presumption is that civilian orders are correct and are legal. And that's an important presumption. The way militaries work is to respond to civilian authority and leadership and the chain of command and act. And so it's really incumbent on the civilians and the military leadership who are giving those orders to give wise, thoughtful orders, because you don't want to have people sitting there trying to suss out whether they should be following an order or not.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're talking about really what amounts to a relationship of mutual trust, where there's a division of roles and both sides sort of trust the other to faithfully take care of their end of the bargain.
Absolutely, as in so much with democratic politics, right? It's sort of exercising restraint, understanding the rules of the game, understanding you're part of a bigger picture, and that applies to civil military relations as well, because you can't rely on the legalities to solve these important complexities of democratic politics. It doesn't, they're important, they're essential, but they're not enough.
And that, in a way, brings us to the Trump presidency and the particular challenges that it presented in terms of civil military relations, because I think if there's one thing that characterizes Trump and his presidency, it's this disregard for those norms and the rules and constraints that govern presidential behavior. When you look at the Trump presidency, what particular challenges do you identify to civil military relations, or damage that might have been done? And are there any particular incidents that really come to mind to illustrate them?
Well, unfortunately, there are a lot of those kinds of incidents during the Trump presidency. And this goes along with his norm-defying sort of manner and approach to politics in general. That applied to civil military relations as well. I guess I could talk about, there's lots of things, as I just said, I could talk about, but one of them, I think that really caused a lot of deep frustration within the military itself. Is sort of Trump exercising his prerogatives to pardon 3 service members who were accused or acquitted of war crimes late last year. That was really something, just a violation of sort of organizational practices, an act that went deeply against sort of maintaining good order and discipline and the sort of functioning of the military and its value system. So I would say that was especially striking. There's also been lots of efforts to politicize the military in all sorts of ways. Unfortunately, there's a long laundry list we could look at, but things like, giving partisan speeches with language that other presidents just wouldn't use to military audiences, signing very controversial executive orders, the so-called Muslim ban and the Hall of Heroes with military personnel in attendance. Things like that are just incredibly striking and really stand out as putting Trump in an exceptional situation in regards to how he managed civil military relations.
It brings me to something that I wanted to ask you, because we've been reading a lot about the politicization of the military. It was a pretty high-profile issue during the 2016 presidential campaign, when there was a sort of a parade of retired generals at both of the parties' conventions. And so I guess what I wanted to ask you is that politicization of the military, is that part and parcel of what you as a scholar of civil military relations is looking at? Is it overlapping but somewhat separate, or is it integral to this prism that you're analyzing the issue through?
It's absolutely essential. And it's essential for a couple of reasons. I mean, to have that trust that we spoke about a few minutes ago, the military has to be perceived and understood by the civilian leadership as being nonpartisan, as deeply burying its personal individuals in those roles, deeply burying their own personal partisan views on issues and trying to rise above that, separating their professional military identity from those roles and in giving advice and sort of operating in that capacity, interacting with civilians. And so when you get a circumstance where rather than sort of reinforcing and supporting that nonpartisan ethic, you have a civilian leader that's trying to elicit partisan behavior from military personnel, it's just corrosive to that underlying need for trust that is there, that is usually what presidents rely upon. Also, it encourages some really negative things within the military because you have already long-term erosion of the nonpartisan ethic. I mean, there's various surveys of military personnel that show that not everyone really buys into the idea that military should be nonpartisan and not make commentary about elected politicians and not sort of wear their partisan colors on their sleeves. And so what are you doing if you're sort of playing upon that? You're encouraging that dynamic rather than trying to encourage the military to address it and sort of have an organizational imperative to sort of look at that problem. So it is definitely essential to civil military relations, and a really important piece of the puzzle that we all study.
Before we get to a closer look at some of the more recent events over the past several weeks since the U.S. presidential election, in fairness, I want to ask about a flip side of civil-military relations. Some of the reports that we've read over the years of officials, whether civilian officials in some of the national security agencies, or maybe misinforming Trump with regard to military operations or numbers of troops present in various theaters, or maybe just sort of keeping him out of the operational loop or withholding options that they might have considered ill-advised in his hands. Is that a problem as well in terms of the military taking prerogatives that aren't necessarily theirs in order to essentially protect the national security interests of the United States?
Yes, it is a problem. And I think it's a sign of some of the dysfunction we've seen in civil military relations. It's somewhat ironic because Trump has ceded more authority, more delegated more power to the military to make decisions about its own operations than prior presidents. Most presidents, whether it's George W. or Barack Obama or their predecessors in many cases, have been accused of micromanagement, of trying to sort of watch what the military is doing too closely and sort of intervene in tactical decisions, move troops, tell the military where to move troops on the ground. And there's always lots of griping about that. And here in this case, we've had just this substantial sort of, we'll let you run the war as you will. And Trump has even used that language explicitly. So on the one hand, there has been, this sort of faith, we're going to let you, do your job, as problematic as that really is. But on the other hand, the military has really run with that and has gone even further in the sense that some of the things that Trump wanted to do, when it has sort of gone against what seemed like the wise decisions given the facts on the ground, or gone against what the military organizationally believed should be done, or those in military leadership positions. And what they've done is to try to manage it. Phil Carter uses this term called polite disobedience, or we could use a term called slow rolling, something like that. And basically, it's a way of subverting civilian authority. So not overtly defying it, right? Or the authority structure still is formally in place, but sort of undermining it. And what do? You do things like you mentioned with the options. You agenda set. So you give 3 options, and 2 of them are absurd, and one of them is what the military thinks should be done, or those leaders presenting those options. Or you just delay in responding and not actually implementing a decision in a timely fashion in one manner or another. And what I worry about is one of the long-term legacies of the Trump civil-military relations period is that this mindset, this sort of ethos of that, we can defy civilian authority and it's okay, the normalization of these kinds of behaviors. It's really unhealthy to those fundamental principles of civilian control, which is the idea that what the military does and how it acts should be organized to support what the civilian elected leadership in the democracy wants. So yeah, that's a deep problem that's going to need some work. There are others, but that one is a big one.
Again, that gets us to this next discussion of the events of the last 3 weeks, because everything you're describing really assumes good faith actors on all sides of the equation. And in the American democratic system, that means 2 parties that are faithfully committed to democracy and the democratic transfer of power based on the outcome of elections. And what we've seen in the last 3 weeks is not only Donald Trump refusing to accept the outcome of the election that was won by President-elect Joe Biden. But more troubling, how few high-level Republican elected officials have been willing to really come out with statements to the effect that Biden won, but also the amount of Republican officials that have been willing to echo Trump's claims, baseless claims of fraud and a stolen election, and now this effort to overturn the election through Republican-controlled state legislatures. What I'm trying to get at isn't necessarily a partisan issue about the Republican Party, so much as what that development means for civil-military relations, for the military chain of command, when there's basically one of the two American political parties that has, in some ways, tarnished its democratic reputation.
Well, I think, first of all, it must create a lot of cognitive dissonance for officers who take an oath to support the Constitution. I think General Votel, former CENTCOM commander, 4-star Army general, retired, had sort of put it really well when he said, that the U.S. military is loyal not to a party or to an interest group, but rather to the offices and to the greater institutions, the greater democratic institutions of the country. To sort of have some politicians making these comments is undermining the sort of core principles that the military upholds. So it must be just a very strange experience on one level. In terms of the larger effects for civil-military relations, I think one way to think about it is in terms of sort of polarization and the sort of divisions of the American population into, different camps. And basically, what implications does that have? That means there is very little neutral ground and sort of space to actually be neutral, to be nonpartisan. Almost everything can now be interpreted in terms of supporting one party or another. I mean, we see this with some of the comments about the, Confederate monuments or racism. These are areas that were would not have seemed like partisan statements in the past, and yet they are. And so what does this mean? This means that there's very little space for the military to occupy as a nonpartisan actor. And it requires a lot more attention and astuteness and sort of self-awareness about how to do that in any given situation. Usually military culture is like, we don't want to think about politics. It doesn't have anything to do with us. We're not political actors. None of that is true, actually, right? And now, even more than ever in the past, they need to think about, what is my role in politics? How, engage with politics in order, paradoxically, to remain apolitical and to remain outside of it. One other sort of feature or issue I think that's coming up, not so much specifically having to do with these anti-democratic comments, but just the divisions about the military. So for many years, since the 90s, the military has been remarkably socially esteemed and by both sides of the aisle. And now you're starting to see a bit of a split in that, with more Republicans liking the military and having confidence in it than Democrats. And what I worry about, or what one thing, and especially if we look around the world, we see this dynamic happening in a lot of countries, is that the military doesn't become a sort of an actor that is supported and beholden to all of the American population, but becomes a sort of co-partisan, or factions of it become allied with one political party, probably the Republican Party. And that's really destructive to the sort of underlying tenets of how the military has operated in the U.S. for, at least since World War II, if not earlier, and sort of this ethic and this role that it plays in American politics.
At the same time, it to my mind, it brings up this one of the many internal contradictions in terms of Donald Trump's presidency, because as much as he's embraced the U.S. military and used it in many ways as a political prop, It's also been a punching bag for him in terms of deflecting blame, in terms of what you mentioned with regard to the pardons that he gave to soldiers that had been convicted in military courts that were very divisive. So at the same time that there's this partisan maybe split that seems to be emerging, Trump himself seems to be in many ways a very polarizing figure, even I imagine for the military chain of command.
Yes. And in fact, your question makes me think about something that I don't think has been fully picked up or amplified as it should. One of the things that Trump has done in his effort to sort of use the military to partisan advantage and to portray it as an ally and to cast blame, all of these dynamics, is he's actually really engaged in actions and language to try to divide the military internally. There have been, I mean, you think about his comments about the generals when the suckers and losers comments came out, that he had referred to people who served as suckers and losers. And around that time, he also made some comments about the generals just being beholden to the military industrial complex, and all they wanted to do was go fight wars so that they could, build up arms and make lots of money in their post-retirement jobs in defense industry. I mean, pretty offensive stuff. But I think what was significant about that is he also then praised enlisted, regular military personnel as he portrays them. And he says, those are my allies. Those are the people that understand me. And this wasn't the first time. There are some reporting in Peter Bergen's book, for example, where he talks about meetings that Trump held with enlisted personnel, Navy and Army, sort of getting their views about Afghanistan and what they thought. Now, this isn't necessarily so unusual or even unhealthy to get views from different sort of levels of the military chain of command and sort of see what they think. But what Trump did was he used it to sort of lambaste his generals and kind of say, you don't know as much as them, and you aren't any good. We should listen to the enlisted and how we run this war. And this is really playing into the country's adversaries. I mean, this is so disturbing, right? Any organization, especially a military organization, relies on its institutional integrity, its cohesion. And when you divide it internally, you have real problems like the U.S. saw in Vietnam, for example. And adversaries are watching this and seeing this. This is really, really subversive, disturbing behavior.
In a sense, it's Trump turning his anti-elitism onto the military itself by demonizing those at the top of the chain of command and championing those below.
Yes. And it's something that as I understand, is not exclusive to the military, as you point out. I mean, he uses these tactics with other institutions, but I think it's got particularly damning implications for this institution, and given its role in protecting national security and what its function is, and given the opportunities it provides to adversaries to further divide the American people, to further corrode its institutions and play upon those themes. And I should add, and for Americans themselves to buy into those narratives and to participate in tearing down our own institutions.
Now, as you mentioned, civil-military relations is more than just this question of giving orders and obeying them. There's also a question of legitimacy of the civilian leadership within the Pentagon. So turning to some of the more concrete outcomes in terms of the military since the election, just in the week after the election, Trump went ahead and he fired his third defense secretary, Mark Esper. He fired Mark Esper's chief of staff, as well as the Defense Department's top policy official and top intelligence official. It was called a decapitation strike on the Pentagon. And at the same time, he replaced at least Esper with someone who hasn't been confirmed by the Senate for the position of defense secretary. What kind of concerns does that raise for you in terms of the potential for military operations in this transition period, which has been mentioned with regard to Iran, for instance, and how legitimate that is, and how the military chain of command uh, can respond to this newly installed civilian leadership just weeks before the end of Trump's presidency?
I mean, it certainly is disruptive and doesn't look good on the surface. So we'll just start with those two things. I think there's been a lot of reading of the tea leaves to trying to figure out what Trump is trying to accomplish. Is this just sort of personal vendettas, rewarding allies? A lot of the sort of narrative now seems to be focused on this is about Afghanistan, keeping campaign promises, getting the military to pull more troops out of Afghanistan from the 4,500 they have there. And there's been some agreement to reduce those numbers. I think the way that I think about the personnel challenges or the personnel changes is if Trump had won a second term, I would find these terrifying. Because what they would sort of be suggesting is an effort to turn the military into sort of on the civilian side to a bunch of yes men, and to use. And I think it's notable when Mark Esper resigned and he gave an interview sort of reviewing his reasons and what had happened. He explicitly used that term. I mean, that was striking that he even referred to the possibility that people would be appointed because they were yes men. And so I don't think it's a fear complete out of the blue that could have been a possibility. I think that now that the transition is moving forward and it's clear we're going to have a new Secretary of Defense and that things are sort of in motion, that I'm less worried about those particular personnel changes. Now, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's something going on that we don't know about that nobody's yet picked up. And it's not healthy to be putting political allies into such important positions just for political peak, for your own reasons in general. But I'm less worried about it than I would be if this was the harbinger of a second term.
Now, you mentioned some of the corrosive effects of the Trump presidency on civil-military relations. I guess to wrap up, do you feel like those are going to be lasting? Are they going to be things that a new leadership, civilian leadership, and a new administration will be able to effectively address? And I guess perhaps most importantly, does anything from the past 4 years highlight for you any necessary reforms or gaps in legislation and the codification of civil military relations that would need to be filled?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's kind of the $1,000,000 question. Are we going to be able to restore norms or not, or is the damage permanent? And I don't think that question just applies to civil military relations. It applies to democratic norms across the board. I would say that of all administrations, you have one coming in with a president who's been in government so long and has interacted with the military in his capacity as vice president. He knows he's more experienced than most in dealing with the military and in sort of putting people into place that will help address some of these issues like the slow rolling and sort of getting all the political appointee positions filled. So I think there's hopeful signs on that. I worry about the lessons that might have been learned, though, whether there are going to be politicians who feel it's more appropriate to treat the military as their co-partisan, as their partisan ally in the past. There is certainly some bad stuff that's been going on a long time that continued and in some ways increased. Some of the commercials and the portrayals of the military as being on particular candidates' sides was pretty bad this election cycle. To me, that's not a good indicator, but it may not mean that there are going to be larger problems, the kind of egregious stuff that Trump did. But I don't think we yet know. I think there's going to be a lot of culture shock within the military leadership. You're going to have a very able, and in fact, many women in roles in a Pentagon that has had, a lot of people who unfilled positions are filled in an acting capacity or filled by men or filled by people with military service. You're going to have real changes in all those respects. You're going to have a robust Office of the Secretary of Defense now. It's sure looking that way. And I think that it's going to be a bit of a shock for the military leadership, for Chairman Milley, for others. But I think that's an appropriate thing, and I'm hopeful about that. I know some of those people, and I have such profound respect for them, and I feel really confident with putting the country's national security in their hands.
Anything that we didn't cover that you think is important to add?
I guess I would just add this. I think when we've talked about civil-military relations, appropriately about the civilian political leadership in the military, but it's really important to remember also, and we talked about the president, that Congress plays a really essential role, and sometimes that role doesn't get highlighted. The military has two masters. It has the presidency, the executive branch, and Congress, and the framers of the Constitution designed it that way on purpose. And so we need to be thinking as we go forward in sort of revitalizing Congress's role in civilian oversight. And last, I would just say the public needs to be engaged. There needs to be more public scrutiny. The military's relationship with the media has been pretty horrific over these last few years for a variety of reasons. And, we need more transparency. There's no way for democratic control of the military to work, meaning that the public holds civilian leaders accountable for the decisions that they take and the actions of the military if the public doesn't know what the military is doing. And so it's time for all of us to sort of, lean in a bit and look and sort of play a role in civil military relations for them to be healthy overall.
Risa, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating discussion.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for taking on this topic, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Likewise. If you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can subscribe to it on the podcast platform of your choice, and you can also find links to do so at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. Trendlines is edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.